Grades are almost never just about grades, right? A bad test score can look like a bad test score on paper, but inside a dad, inside of you and me, it it sometimes can mean a whole lot more. Sometimes it can mean fear or disappointment. It can mean, are they going to be okay? Am I doing enough? It can even mean, what does this say about their future? And if we're not careful, one rough academic moment or something like that, that can really start carrying way more emotional weight than it was ever meant to carry. Hi, I'm Dan Hayden. This is the Positive Legacy Podcast for Christian Fathers. This is episode 39, titled Don't Carry Their Entire Future All at Once. We're in the middle of this series that I started, Parenting Teens, in real time. And I want to spend some time in the easiest places for dads to really drift out of steady influence into pressure. Things like school, performance, and the future. And like I've said in the last couple of episodes, even if your kids are younger, this still matters. My younger kids, grades are still important for them too, right? And if you're older, hopefully these conversations will bring some memories back and you can take this stuff and hand it off to other men who are in similar circumstances. Because the deeper issue here, it's not about algebra or trigonometry. It's not even about transcripts or college or career. It's what happens inside you when your kid's performance starts feeling, tied to their worth, or tied to your worth, or their future in a way that just gets too heavy for everyone. So let's walk into a real moment from my own house. And I've told the story before, but it's a great backdrop because I think it gets right at the heart of all of this. A while back, I don't know, last November, December, something like that, our twin daughters, they took the same math test in the same class at the same time, sitting right next to each other. One of them got a really, really good grade. And the other one, yeah, not so much. Which, kind of, at least we know they weren't cheating off each other. But it was rough, and it was disappointing. But just wasn't just disappointing. It was rough. I talked to my wife who gave me a warning, and the first thought that came to my head when I hung up the phone was, what does my daughter need in this moment when I pick them up from school? What do each of them need? So when I picked them up from school, I looked in the back seat to the daughter who had the higher grade, and I was like, "Hey, that's awesome, good job. We're super proud of you. Good work." And I knew the other daughter, was probably carrying a heavy mix of embarrassment and frustration, and maybe, hopefully not, but maybe some shame too. And I remember very clearly having to sort of settle something in myself, both after I got off of the phone with my wife and as I was driving to the school and as they got in the car, before they even opened the car doors, I had to really dig into what do they need right now? And, that question mattered because, there were a lot of other directions I could have gone. I could have come in hot. I could have come in, lecturing her. I could have made the whole ride home, which isn't a very long car ride, but still, it can get real uncomfortable real quick sometimes in those circumstances. And I think you know what I'm talking about. But I could have made that whole car ride about the consequences and disappointment with a lot of fair dose of judgment. I could have let my fear about habits or responsibility, I could have let all of that just sort of take over. But we've been through that. I went through that as a kid. That was not what she needed. It's not gonna help in that moment. And this is the kind of thing that I help dads work through in my coaching too, because, these are the moments where, leadership, you being the leader in your family, that's when leadership, gets tested for real. Not in theory, not when you're calm and reflective, with a cup of coffee in the morning. It gets tested in the car, gets tested in the kitchen when everybody's in the morning running around trying to get ready. In the 10 minutes, it gets tested in the 10 minutes right after, you get information you don't like I had that day. So anyway, I picked him up, and like I said, I turned to the first daughter, who was sitting in the back, and I said, "Hey, congrats, great job. We're super proud of you." Then I turned to the one who was brave enough to sit in the front seat because they rotate who gets shotgun, and they argue about it every day, just like we did when we were kids. So anyway, I turned to her and I said, "Hey," with a lot of empathy, because that's what I told myself that's what she needed. I said, "Hey, how you doing?" She just kind of looked down, and she's like, "Dad, that was rough." From there, instead of launching into correction or criticism, I just started asking questions. I started coaching, asking questions like, did you feel prepared? Now, I typically don't like to use yes or no questions, but sometimes those are good entryways. She's like, I don't know. Well, what did you do to prepare? And she talked about sort of the studying stuff, and I said, well, looking back, do you honestly feel like you were well prepared, for that exam? And she confessed no. Um, and I asked her, what do you think got in the way of that? And, by the time we got home, we were just in a much better place. She was in a much better place, mentally to receive that conversation. Now, look, I want to be clear about something. This was not me pretending the grade didn't matter. It absolutely mattered. There were still consequences, right? We can still set boundaries even in these moments. Yeah, I made it clear to her that this didn't meet our standards, and I didn't think it met her standards either. And she affirmed me in that. Look, she lost her phone for a week, and she couldn't spend any more nights at her friend's house until her grades improved. So this was not just softness pretending to be wisdom. This was coaching, because my kids are at the age where I got to start coaching them now. And there's a real difference between coaching your kids and sort of pushing. Right? Pushing says, I need to make sure you feel the weight of this as fast as possible. Coaching says in those moments, I'm going to help you understand what happened. I'm going to allow you the opportunity to take responsibility for it and build a better path forward, right? That's what coaching is. Where do you want to go? Where are you now? Where do you want to go? And let's help you get there. That pushing often comes out of fear, and coaching comes from steadiness and from things like curiosity and gentleness and self-control. Pushing is more about relieving our own anxieties than helping them grow. Look, I had a lot of angst when I was a kid over grades. Um, I was pushed, right? And many of you know that. But coaching is about helping them become the kind of person who can recover and respond and learn and take ownership of this sort of stuff. That distinction matters more than a lot of us dads realize. Because when grades start carrying too much emotional weight, our kids can start to feel like maybe love and approval are somehow riding on performance. I tell my daughter this all the time in softball too. Bad things are gonna happen. The ball's not gonna go where you want it to go all the time. But how are you gonna respond? I'm constantly reminding them, I love watching you play this game. None of it's based on performance. And most dads, they don't necessarily mean to communicate, in a way that makes their kids sort of bear that burden of all that emotional weight. Um, but it can leak out in subtle ways, right? It can leak out with a tighter tone, a disappointed face, a heavy silence, and I'm guilty of it too. It can also leak out with a noticeable relief when they finally succeed, in a different kind of energy when they don't succeed. Our kids notice all of that, and over time, if we're not careful, they can start drawing conclusions like, "Hey, I'm easier to be around when I'm succeeding." Dad is calmer when I perform well, or things like, "My future is a pressure point, not a place of possibility." Sometimes they might be thinking, like, if I fail, I'm letting people down. That's why grades and stuff like, grades and performance, they're almost never just about the grades. They often tap into, our deeper fears as dads. Are they going to become responsible adults? Are they going to waste their potential? Will they be able to make it in the real world, quote unquote, real world? Will they have the opportunities that they need? Did I miss something as a parent? Sometimes our saboteurs come into it. And if you've got a hyperachiever saboteur or any judge, and spoiler alert, we all have the judge, speak trying to break through and speak to us. This area can get loaded real fast. You may tell yourself, this is just me being a caring parent. I just care. And you do. I don't doubt that you do. You absolutely do. But sometimes care gets hijacked by fear and comes out sounding like pressure or sounding like criticism. That's one of the things I help dads untangle in coaching all the time. A lot of good men, they don't realize how quickly their love starts to sound like evaluation or criticism when they get anxious about the future. So let's slow that down a little bit. And I think it helps to separate three things that we often blend together without noticing. And that's performance, character, and identity. Performance is how they did on the test. Character is how they respond to the result of that test. And identity is who they are before God and in your family. Notice those are not the same thing. A bad grade is real. It may reflect poor preparation, as it did in this case. It may reflect distraction. Again, it's tied to poor preparation in this specific case. It could reflect the avoider saboteur in them. Spoiler, she got that from me. Or a lack of responsibility. But it is not the same thing as bad character. She didn't purposely set out to get a bad grade. And it is definitely not the same thing as a damaged identity. Because if you collapse all three together, the conversation gets way too heavy, way too fast. Now it's not, you didn't do well on the test. Now it's, you are irresponsible and your future is in danger. That is a crushing amount of meaning to load onto one moment, onto one test. A steadier response sounds more like this. Look, this result matters. It's an indicator. It tells us something needs attention. But it does not tell me everything about who you are, and it doesn't define your future. That's how you hold standards without turning your kid into a performance project. And this is where coaching becomes so important. Coaching, again, asks different questions than pressure does. Pressure asks things like, what is wrong with you? Why don't you care more? How could you let this happen? Whereas coaching asks questions like, what do you think happened here? What part of this was in your control? What would better preparation have looked like? What support do you need? And you explore those things with them. You brainstorm. Again, get curious, get innovative. Those kinds of conversations build ownership instead of shame. And ownership is really what we want, what we're after here. When I look back on that math test moment, what I'm almost grateful for is not that I had the perfect words, because I didn't. What I'm grateful for the most is that I was calm enough not to make her carry my fear on top of her disappointment, because it mattered to her too, right? But the fact that I was able to stay calm and steady, and she didn't have to carry my fears, that matters, because she was already feeling the consequences of that result. She didn't need me to add panic to it. She needed clarity. She needed some hard truths, right? And she needed a path forward. And that's another place where dads often need support. A lot of us know what standard we want to hold. What we don't always know is how to hold it without bringing extra emotional sort of volatility into the room. And if that's you, you're exactly the kind of dad I build my coaching around. Not because you don't care, but because you care deeply and you want to lead better in the moments that matter. And now let's take a step back and widen the lens a little on this. Because one bad test score can quietly open the door to future anxieties. If my kid is struggling now, what does that mean later? Will they be ready for college? Will they be mature enough for adult life? Will they know how to work hard? Are they going to drift? Will they squander opportunities, right? Those are real fears. And I totally get it. I absolutely understand that. But one of the biggest mistakes we make is dragging the whole future into the present moment. A rough week in math becomes a verdict on adulthood. A late assignment, and there are going to be late assignments. A late assignment becomes a prophecy about work ethic. A distracted season, or maybe even just a really busy one, becomes a whole identity story. And that almost never helps. Your teenager does need help thinking long term. Absolutely. But they need the future handed to them in manageable, bite sized pieces, not as a giant cloud of our own parental anxiety. One of the most loving things you can do is keep bringing the conversation back to the next faithful step. Not what does this mean about your entire future, but instead, hey, what's the next right move here? You don't have to ask, are you ruining your chances? But instead, you ask, what would responsibility look like, this week? Definitely don't say stuff like, why can't you be more like your sister? By the way, not a phrase that I've uttered. Okay. Just for the record. But instead, hey, what did this teach you about how you prepare for these exams? Because trust me, my twins were born 2 minutes apart, and they couldn't be more like more unalike than if one of them were a boy. Okay, one of them prepares much differently for exams than the other, so it's not as if I can say, "Hey, you should go talk to your sister, see how she works through this stuff." Trust me, it's not going to work. But that was especially important in our situation because both girls, again, like I said, took the same test sitting right next to each other. Comparison, especially when you have twins, it's available everywhere, and it was certainly available in that moment. Um, and comparison is like it's like poison in family life. How many times did your parents compare you to a brother or a sister? And it just didn't land well, right? So even if you never say it out loud, your teenager can feel it if one sibling becomes the standard and the other becomes the concern. Again, not a part of our vernacular and not a part of our mindset in our house. So part of wise parenting in performance moments, like the tests, is refusing to parent by comparison. Each kid, and look, this is true in leadership too, right? When I was in the Army, every one of my soldiers and every one of my NCOs, they just needed something different. They needed me to lead them differently. Um, and every kid processes things differently. Every child has different strengths. They have different struggles and pacing and insecurities. The goal is not to make one kid into the other. And I don't believe that anyone who's listening to this podcast is trying to do that. But the goal is to help each one grow in their own way, in wisdom, and in ownership, and in resilience. And yeah, sometimes that includes consequences. So I want to keep saying that because I know some dads hear coaching and they think, so I just talk gently, remove all accountability. I just ask a bunch of opening questions. No, no, coaching and consequences absolutely can live together. In our case, they certainly did. The phone went away, and some of her privileges were adjusted until her grade improved. Luckily for her, she had her final about 10 days later. So, and she crushed it. But the expectations were made clear. The spirit of the conversation was still, we are going to work this out. It was not, you have to now become, or you have now become a disappointment that I need to manage. That difference sort of changes everything. It changed the outcome too, because she adjusted, like I said, she prepared differently. And she came back stronger on the next one. And that's what you want from this, right? You, you don't expect perfection. We want growth. We want recovery. We want ownership. And she had all of those things. We want a stronger next step. So if school, grades, or the future have been carrying a lot of emotional energy in your house, here's a question worth sitting with. Am I trying to help my teenager grow? Or am I trying to quiet my own fears? That's a hard question, but it's certainly a clarifying one. Sometimes the pressure we put on them is really about the pressure we're carrying inside of us. And if that's true, the work begins with us. And that's why, in my coaching work, I often help dads slow down not just the conversation with their kids or with their wives, but the conversations that they're having within themselves. What story am I telling? Well, what am I making this mean? What fear is hiding underneath all this urgency? Those are powerful questions. Let me give you something practical you can use this week. The next time your kid brings home a disappointing result, or even the next time you think about their academic future and you feel yourself tightening up, or their performance falters in some way, some aspect of their life. Yeah, I want you to use this simple framework: pause, affirm, ask, clarify, coach. Pause before you speak. Do not let the first voice be your panic. In my case, I had the luxury of, I had a couple of hours for me to internalize this. But still, when I hung up the phone after Holly gave me the news about the test score, my initial reaction was not anger or fear or judgment. It was empathy. What does my daughter need? So don't let the first voice be panic. Affirm something that's true, right? I know this feels rough. Thanks for being honest with me. Then ask what happened. What do you think got in the way? How well prepared do you think you were? Then get clarification, or at least clarify. This doesn't meet the standard we're aiming for. This still matters, and we are not going to ignore this. Then coach the next step. Hey, what needs to change before next time? What kind of support do you think you might need? And what is your plan to get better next time? And don't expect all of these answers to come in just one conversation. This conversation I had very similar conversation with my daughter. This came over the course of the next 3 to 5 days. And that's a much stronger leadership move than lecturing or minimizing or like I said, coming in hot. And the good news is all of this is repeatable. And because of the way our brains work, the more we do it, the more we're going to be able to do it. So again, here's the challenge for you this week. Take one area where your kid's performance has been stirring up a little bit of anxiety for you. It's summertime, but I don't know when you're listening to this podcast. So maybe it's Aiden, maybe you're in that season right now. Maybe you're not. Maybe it's athletics. Maybe it's music. Either way, pick an area where your kid's performance has been stirring up some anxiety. Maybe it's about their effort. It might be just their general seriousness about whatever it is you're talking about. And put pen to paper, journal. Don't put it in your notes on your iPhone. Put pen to paper. So many more neural pathways are built when you're actually physically writing something down than when you're typing it into a phone or in a computer. Here's some things to journal, though, right? What results or what behavior is bothering me about this? What am I afraid this means about their future? And what would coaching sound like here instead of pressure? That's it. And I'll tell you, these 3 things, I'm going to put them in the show notes so you can go back and you can look at them. But look, you're not solving their whole future. You're clarifying how you want to show up in the next conversation. And if your kids are younger, you can still do this with chores or effort or responsibility. The principle is the same. Don't load the whole future onto one moment. And if this episode is landing hard for you, if you're realizing that grades and performance and future plans have started carrying just too much emotional weight in your house, I want to invite you to a next step. This is one of the places where dads often look calm on the outside, but feel deeply anxious on the inside. And because of that, it's one of the places where coaching can be especially powerful. And inside my Positive Legacy Academy, we work on exactly these kinds of moments. How to stay calm when your kid underperforms, how to separate identity from outcome, how to ask better questions, and be in the mindset to ask those better questions. how to hold standards without creating, fear-based sort of pressure. And of course, how to lead your home in a way that helps your family grow, not just comply. If you want support in any of that, I'd love to invite you to a complimentary coaching call. On that call, we can talk about where school or performance or future anxieties, where they're showing up in your house right now, or and how you've been responding. What kind of father do you want to be in those conversations? And whether coaching with me and a group of other Christian dads would be a helpful next step for you. You can grab a time that works for you through the link in the show notes. Look, you are not responsible for controlling your child's entire future, but you are responsible for how you show up in the moments that help shape their future. As you think about your teenager or your kids this week, where do you need to trade pressure for coaching in one conversation that really matters? Until next time, stay rooted in grace, stay steady in mind and spirit, and keep building your positive legacy, one small intentional moment at a time. As always, I'll talk to you again next week. Thanks.